Your father would have wanted this." Those words echoed through my mind as I stared at the empty space where my grandmother's antique Steinway piano once stood. For 3 generations, that piano had been the heart of every family gathering, every holiday celebration, every milestone in our lives. Now, all that remained was a rectangular patch of unfaded hardwood floor, a ghostly reminder of what was stolen from me. The afternoon light streaming through the bay windows seemed to mock the void, highlighting the absence of the instrument that had defined our family's legacy for nearly a century. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sophia Martinez, and I just discovered that my husband secretly gave my inherited family piano, worth $2.3 million, to his mother, claiming it was collecting dust in our music room. The same piano that had traveled from war-torn Vienna in 1939 survived a transatlantic journey hidden in a cargo ship, and eventually became the cornerstone of my grandmother's rise to international acclaim. Now, it sat in someone else's hands, taken without my knowledge or consent. The irony? I'm a concert pianist, and in exactly 47 minutes, I'm scheduled to perform at the grand opening of his mother's new music conservatory. A conservatory built with money that I now suspect came from selling more than just my piano. The thought made my fingers twitch, muscle memory reaching for keys that were no longer there. I traced my fingers along the empty space where the piano had lived for the past decade, feeling the slight indentations it had left in the hardwood. The instrument wasn't just valuable in monetary terms. It was the last connection to my grandmother, Victoria Romano, once celebrated as one of Europe's finest classical pianists. She had played for presidents, royal families, and sold out concert halls across 3 continents. That piano had been her constant companion through triumph and tragedy, and through it, she taught me everything I know about music and life. The memories flooded back as I stood in the silence of the music room. Hours spent watching her hands dance across the keys, her voice gently guiding me through complicated passages. "Music is mathematics of the soul," she would say, her accent thickening with emotion. "Each note must be precise, but the feeling must be wild and free." Those lessons weren't just about music. They were about passion, dedication, and the courage to fight for what you believe in. Mrs. Reynolds? Maria, our housekeeper of 15 years, stood in the doorway, concern etched on her face. She had been more family than employee since I married. James, always there with a comforting word or a knowing look. Today, her usually warm brown eyes were clouded with worry. "Your mother-in-law called again. She wants to confirm you'll be playing Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto No. 1 for tonight's opening ceremony." I almost laughed at the absurdity. Evelyn Reynolds, my mother-in-law, knew exactly what that piece meant to me. It was the last piece my grandmother ever taught me, right here, on that very piano. We had spent months perfecting it together, even as her health declined. The final time she heard me play, it was the night before she passed away, her smile radiant with pride and love. Now, Evelyn wanted me to perform it on the very instrument she had helped steal from our family. "Tell her I'll be there," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. The crystal chandelier above caught the late afternoon sun, casting prismatic shadows across the empty floor. "And Maria? How long have you known the piano was gone?" Maria's eyes dropped to the floor, her hands twisting the edge of her apron, a nervous habit I'd noticed over the years. "Mr. Reynolds had it moved 3 weeks ago, while you were on tour in Vienna. He said it was a surprise for his mother's conservatory opening. I wanted to tell you, but he insisted it was all arranged with your approval." 3 weeks. The same time period during which my husband, James Reynolds, had been restructuring my family's trust fund, the one my grandmother left specifically for the preservation of our musical legacy. The coincidence was too perfect to be accidental. James had always been methodical in his planning, a trait I once admired in a corporate lawyer. Now I wondered how long he had been plotting this betrayal. I walked to my desk, my heels clicking against the hardwood in a rhythm that seemed to echo the emptiness of the room. Opening my laptop, I pulled up the trust fund statements I'd been investigating since noticing discrepancies in the accounts. As the primary beneficiary, I should have been notified of any transactions. Instead, I found a web of transfers, all authorized by James using the power of attorney I'd granted him 2 years ago when I was too busy with my international tour to manage the paperwork. A notification popped up on my screen, an email from Theodore Chen, my grandmother's former financial advisor and one of the few people who truly understood the significance of our family's musical heritage. Urgent. Discovered something about the Romano Trust. Call immediately. I glanced at the clock. 6:13 p.m. The conservatory opening was at 7 Mai. The Reynolds family had chosen the time deliberately, knowing it coincided with the exact hour my grandmother would begin her performances. Just enough time to make a call. That could change everything. I dialed Theodore's number, my free hand instinctively moving to the empty space where my grandmother's piano should have been. The contrast between the cool evening air from the open window and the warmth of the fading sunlight seemed to mirror the conflict raging within me. Sophia. Theodore's voice was grim, the weight of his discovery evident in every syllable. I've been trying to reach you. The trust fund. It's not just the piano. There's more. Much more. My fingers curled into a fist, nails digging into my palm. The pain helped me focus, centering my thoughts just as my grandmother had taught me to do before difficult performances. Tell me everything. As Theodore spoke, pieces started falling into place like a complex symphony reaching its crescendo. The mysterious renovations at Evelyn's conservatory, far more extensive than a simple building restoration should have cost. James's recent insistence that I sign additional paperwork without reading it, claiming it was just routine trust fund, maintenance. The way both he and his mother had been pushing me to transfer my upcoming performances to their new venue, speaking of family loyalty and shared legacy. They hadn't just taken my piano. They were systematically dismantling everything my grandmother had built, transforming her vision of accessible musical education into another elite Reynolds family enterprise. A text from James lit up my phone, his message carrying the same condescending tone he'd recently adopted. "Where are you? Mother's asking about the performance. Don't forget, this is a big night for our family." Our family. I stared at those words, remembering how my grandmother used to say that real legacy isn't in the things we inherit, but in what we choose to do with them. Her voice seemed to fill the empty room, carrying the wisdom of years spent fighting for her place in a world that had tried to silence her. I stood up, smoothing my concert dress. Black silk with subtle gold embroidery. Another inheritance. From my grandmother. "Theodore, I need you to send everything you've found to my email, and then I need you to make some calls. It's time for the Reynolds family to learn what happens when you steal a pianist's symphony." I picked up my phone and texted James back. "Don't worry, tonight's performance will be unforgettable." The words glowed on the screen, a promise and a warning wrapped in 6 simple words. In my mind, I could almost hear my grandmother's voice, thick with her Argentine accent but clear as crystal. Music isn't just about playing the right notes, mi amor. It's about knowing exactly when to bring the house down. And tonight, that's exactly what I plan to do. The drive to Evelyn's conservatory gave me time to process Theodore's revelations. The setting sun painted downtown Los Angeles in shades of amber and gold, a beautiful backdrop that contrasted sharply with the ugliness I'd just uncovered. According to Theodore's investigation, the piano was just the beginning. James and his mother had been systematically liquidating my grandmother's entire musical collection for the past year. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I recalled the details. Rare sheet music collections sold to private collectors. vintage recordings auctioned off to overseas buyers. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Even my grandmother's extensive library of musical manuscripts, supposedly being digitized for preservation, had been quietly dispersed to various buyers across Europe and Asia. Traffic slowed to a crawl on Figueroa Street, giving me an unwanted clear view of the conservatory's facade. The building rose like a modern cathedral of glass and steel, its architecture a stark departure from the warm, inviting spaces my grandmother had always created for her students. The gleaming sign caught the last rays of sunlight. Reynolds, Institute of Musical Excellence. They hadn't even had the decency to include the Romano name, despite using our family's legacy to fund it. I checked my phone. 3 missed calls from James, 2 from Evelyn. A text message from an unknown number caught my eye. Mrs. Reynolds, this is Amanda Chen from the LA Times. I'd love to discuss your involvement in the Romano Reynolds Music Initiative. Your grandmother's collection has generated quite a buzz. In the classical music community, my stomach churned. They were already spinning the story, presenting the systematic theft of my inheritance as some sort of joint family venture. I could picture Evelyn's satisfied smile as she showcased my grandmother's piano as the centerpiece of her new empire, probably spinning some tale about honoring the Romano legacy while erasing our family's true history. The parking attendant recognized me, quickly directing me to the VIP section. Mrs. Reynolds, your husband asked us to watch for you. He's waiting in the green room. The young man's earnest expression suggested he had no idea of the drama unfolding behind the conservatory's pristine facade. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror, ensuring my game face was firmly in place. The woman staring back at me looked exactly like what they expected. The perfectly polished concert pianist, ready to play her part in the family spectacle. If only they knew what else I had prepared for tonight's performance. The conservatory's backstage area hummed with pre-opening activity. Staff members hurried past with flowers and programs, caterers arranged elaborate displays, and the murmur of arriving guests echoed through the halls. A large poster near the entrance caught my eye, my own image beside the Steinway, taken last year during a benefit concert. Tonight, Sophia Reynolds performs Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto No. 1 on the historic Romano Steinway. There you are. James's voice carried down the corridor, heavy with relief and a touch of annoyance. Mother's been worried sick. Why haven't you been answering your phone? I turned to face my husband of 5 years, the man I thought I knew. He looked immaculate in his tuxedo, every inch the successful lawyer and devoted son. The golden cufflinks he wore, my Christmas gift from last year, glinted under the lights, another bitter reminder of the trust I'd misplaced. I was practicing, I replied, the lie flowing smoothly. You know how I get before performances. It wasn't entirely false. I had been practicing, just not the piece they expected. James's hand settled on my lower back, guiding me toward the green room. The gesture, once comforting, now felt like another form of control. Mother wants to discuss the program order. She thinks we should start with the Tchaikovsky, really grab everyone's attention right from the start. Of course she did. The piece that meant so much to my grandmother turned into a mere promotional tool. Whatever you think is best, I said, noting how James's shoulders relaxed at my apparent compliance. The green room was a study in calculated luxury. Fresh flowers, champagne on ice, and elegant furnishings carefully chosen to impress potential donors. Evelyn Reynolds stood by the window, resplendent in designer evening wear that probably cost more than most working musicians made in a year. "Darling!" she exclaimed, air kissing my cheeks. "We were beginning to worry. The governor's wife is already seated, and you know how she appreciates punctuality." Her smile remained fixed, but her eyes studied me carefully, perhaps searching for signs that I'd discovered their scheme. I smiled back, channeling years of performance experience into maintaining my composure. I wouldn't dream of disappointing our guests. The piano's ready? The question was innocent enough, but I saw the quick glance between mother and son. Of course, Evelyn replied smoothly. We had it tuned this morning. Your grandmother's instrument deserves nothing but the best care. The irony of her words would have been amusing if it wasn't so infuriating. As if on cue, the stage manager appeared at the door. 15 minutes to curtain, Mrs. Reynolds. The timeline was perfect, exactly when Theodore had promised to have everything in place. I excused myself to do my pre-performance routine, finding a quiet corner in the adjoining powder room. My phone vibrated with a message from Theodore. All set. Key players in position. Paperwork delivered to target recipients. Break a leg. I closed my eyes, centering myself as my grandmother had taught me. The weight of her absence felt especially heavy tonight, but I could almost hear her voice. Remember, mi amor, sometimes the most powerful note is the one you don't play. Taking a deep breath, I smoothed my dress and checked my appearance one final time. The woman in the mirror looked ready to perform, but tonight's real performance wouldn't be at the piano. As I headed toward the stage, I thought about how fitting it was that they chose Tchaikovsky for tonight's program. After all, like the composer himself once said, there is no joy in music if it is played without passion. And passion was one thing the Reynolds family was about to learn I had in abundance. The backstage corridor leading to the main hall felt longer than usual, each step bringing me closer to the moment of truth. Through the heavy curtains, I could hear the measured tones of Evelyn's welcome speech, her voice carrying the practiced warmth she reserved for potential donors and press cameras. And tonight, we're especially honored to showcase a piece of musical history, she was saying, her words making my blood simmer. The Romano Steinway, a testament to our commitment to preserving classical music's greatest treasures. A stagehand appeared at my elbow, clipboard in hand. Mrs. Reynolds, there's been a slight program change. Mrs. Reynolds, your mother-in-law, wants to make a special announcement before your performance. The young woman looked apologetic, but I detected a hint of curiosity in her expression. What kind of announcement? I asked, though I already had my suspicions. My phone buzzed silently in my clutch. Another message from Theodore, but it would have to wait. Something about a new scholarship program in your grandmother's name, she replied, checking her notes. The Romano Reynolds Excellence Fund? Of course. They weren't content with just stealing my inheritance. They had to appropriate my grandmother's name as well. I nodded, maintaining my composed expression while my mind raced through the implications. The timing wasn't ideal, but perhaps this would make the evening's revelations even more poetic. From my position in the wings, I could see the full house, every seat filled with Los Angeles cultural elite. The governor and his wife in the AISA front row, several prominent critics from major publications, and at least a dozen potential donors whose combined net worth could fund a small nation. Evelyn had always known how to draw a crowd. My eyes drifted to the piano, my grandmother's Steinway, positioned center stage under the subtle glow of perfectly arranged spotlights. Even from here, I could see the distinctive mother-of-pearl inlay along its sides, a custom detail my grandfather had commissioned for their 20th anniversary. The instrument looked almost alien in this modern space, its rich history at odds with the conservatory's sleek contemporary design. James appeared beside me, his hand reaching for mine. Ready, darling. Mother's about to announce the scholarship program. We thought it would be the perfect way to honor your grandmother's legacy. His voice carried that particular tone he used when he thought he was being especially clever or considerate. I let him take my hand, noting how he'd positioned us to be visible to the audience through the partially open curtain. Always conscious of appearances, my husband. It's certainly unexpected, I replied, careful to keep my voice neutral. Though I wonder what grandmother would think of her name being used this way. A flicker of something, uncertainty, concern, crossed James's face, but before he could respond, Evelyn's voice commanded attention once again. "Ladies and gentlemen, before our main performance, I have a special announcement." She paused for effect, her silver hair catching the stage, lights like a crown. "Tonight, we're not just celebrating the opening of a new cultural landmark. We're also launching the Romano Reynolds Excellence Fund, a scholarship program that will ensure talented young musicians have access to world-class education, regardless of their circumstances." The audience applauded appreciatively. I felt James squeeze my hand, probably interpreting my stillness as emotion rather than the cold fury it really was. If he had bothered to really know me, to understand my grandmother's true legacy, he would have recognized the danger signs. "This program," Evelyn continued, "will be funded through the sale of select pieces from the historic Romano collection, a transformation of physical artifacts into living opportunities for the next generation of musicians." My phone buzzed, again, more insistently this time. Under the cover of the continued applause, I slipped it from my clutch. Theodore's messages glowed on the screen. Documents delivered to all major critics in attendance. LA Times reporter has full story ready to go. Board members received proof of unauthorized sales. Livestream secure and ready. I allowed myself a small smile. While James and Evelyn had been planning their grand announcement, they'd forgotten one crucial detail about my grandmother's legacy: her insistence on documenting everything. Every piece in her collection had been meticulously catalogued, its provenance and ownership clearly established. More importantly, she had made sure I understood the legal framework protecting our family's heritage. And now, Evelyn was wrapping up her speech, "It gives me great pleasure to introduce our featured performer, my dear daughter-in-law, Sophia Reynolds, playing Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto No. 1 on the historic Romano Steinway." The audience applauded as James guided me toward the stage. "Make us proud, darling," he whispered, kissing my cheek for the benefit of the cameras. I stepped into the spotlight, the familiar weight of anticipation settling over me. But tonight, the tension wasn't about the music. It was about timing. As I took my place at the piano, I caught sight of several critics already looking at their phones, no doubt reading Theodore's carefully prepared dossier. My fingers hovered over the keys, grandmother's voice echoing in my memory. "The piano can whisper secrets or shout truths. Murmur. The choice is always yours." I had made my choice. And as the first notes of Tchaikovsky filled the hall, I knew that by the time I played the final chord, the Reynolds' carefully constructed facade would crumble like a house of cards in a hurricane. The final notes of Tchaikovsky's opening movement resonated through the hall, met with enthusiastic applause. But I wasn't watching the audience. I was watching the critics' row, where phones had begun to light up like fireflies in the dark. Theodore's timing was impeccable. From my position at the piano, I could see James shifting uncomfortably in his seat as several board members leaned over to whisper urgently in his ear. Evelyn's perfectly composed facade showed its first crack when her personal assistant hurried down the aisle, tablet in hand. The look of confusion on her face quickly transformed into something darker as she scanned the screen. I moved into the second movement, letting my fingers dance across the keys that held so many memories. Each note seemed to carry a story, not just of my grandmother's legacy, but of the meticulous paper trail she'd left behind. Receipts, certificates of authenticity, legal documents establishing clear ownership rights. Everything the Reynolds family had tried to erase. A commotion near the back of the hall drew scattered attention. Amanda Chen from the LA Times had just published her article. I could tell by the way phones were suddenly everywhere, their soft blue glow illuminating shocked expressions throughout the audience. The headline would be appearing on screens across the city: "Historic Musical Collection Illegally Sold. Reynolds Conservatory Opening Marred by Scandal." The second movement reached its crescendo as two men in suits, representatives from the EE District Attorney's Office right on schedule, quietly entered through the main doors. They took positions near the exits, professional and unobtrusive, but their presence sent a clear message to anyone who recognized them. I caught James's eye as I transitioned into the final movement. The look of dawning horror on his face told me he was finally putting the pieces together. His mother's grip on his arm had become vice-like, her knuckles white against the dark fabric of his sleeve. The whispering among the board members had grown more intense. The Romano Reynolds Excellence Fund announcement had played right into our hands. Theodore's documentation showed exactly where the money for their scholarship program had come from. The unauthorized sale of my grandmother's priceless collection. Every transaction, every forged signature, every manipulated document laid bare for the world to see. As I approached the concerto's famous finale, I allowed myself a moment to appreciate the irony. This performance was being live-streamed across all the conservatory's social media channels, just as Evelyn had planned. But instead of showcasing her triumph, it was broadcasting her downfall to thousands of viewers in real time. The governor's wife was already gathering her things, making a discreet but hasty exit. Several other prominent donors followed suit, not wanting to be associated with what was quickly becoming a very public scandal. The critics' row had transformed into a hub of furious typing and whispered phone calls. I could feel the tension, building in the hall like a physical presence. Security personnel had begun to move closer to the stage, responding to some unseen signal. Whether they were there to protect the Reynolds family or to prevent their escape wasn't yet clear. Through it all, my grandmother's Steinway sang true and clear. Each note was a testament to her legacy, not just as a musician, but as a woman who understood the power of preparation and patience. In music, as in life, she used to say, timing is everything. The final chords approached, and I poured every ounce of emotion into them. Not just for the music, but for every moment that had led to this. The years of being underestimated, of watching James and Evelyn plot and scheme, of pretending not to notice as they systematically dismantled my inheritance. As the last note faded, I stood and turned to face the audience. The customary applause was scattered, distracted. Most attention was focused on the growing chaos in the VIP section, where board members had surrounded James and Evelyn, demanding explanations. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a sealed envelope, my final gift to the Reynolds family. Inside was my resignation from their board of directors, along with detailed evidence of their financial misconduct, all time-stamped well before tonight's performance. They couldn't claim this, was a vindictive response to their announcement. The trap had been set long before they ever stepped into it. Theodore appeared at my side, right on cue. "The DA's office is ready," he murmured, "and the original board members from your grandmother's foundation are waiting in the wings. Everything's in place." I nodded, watching as Evelyn finally lost her composure, her voice rising above the growing tumult. "This is ridiculous. We had every right. The collection was just gathering dust." "Actually," I said, my voice carrying in the acoustically perfect hall she'd built with my family's money, "you had no rights at all. The Romano collection was never yours to sell." I turned to address the shocked audience, many of whom were still trying to process the evening's dramatic turn. "I apologize for the disruption, but I believe transparency is essential in the arts. Just as every note must be true, so must every deed." James started toward the stage, his face a mask of desperate anger, but security intercepted him, not the conservatory's security. These were federal agents, there to investigate the interstate sale of stolen cultural artifacts. Another detail Evelyn had overlooked in her rush to build her empire. My grandmother's voice seemed to whisper in my ear, "The finest music comes from the heart, mi amor. but the smartest musician always reads the fine print. I smiled, thinking of the document Theodore had shown me earlier. The original trust agreement, with its very specific clause about the collection's preservation. The Reynolds family had been so busy trying to appropriate my legacy, they'd forgotten to check what legal traps might be hidden in its foundations. The next few minutes unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony of chaos. Federal agents moved through the hall with practiced efficiency, securing exits and collecting devices. The live stream continued rolling, capturing every moment of the Reynolds family's unraveling for an audience that had grown from thousands to hundreds of thousands. This is absurd! Evelyn's voice cracked with indignation as an agent respectfully but firmly asked her to remain seated. We built this conservatory. We're preserving musical heritage. Her designer clutch fell open, spilling papers across the polished floor. Among them, I recognized the forged documents bearing my signature, the ones she'd planned to use tonight to officially announce my support of their scholarship program. James lunged forward suddenly, not toward me, but toward the piano. The authentication papers, he hissed at his mother. They're still in the bench. Too late. Theodore was already there, removing a leather portfolio that contained every falsified provenance document they'd created to sell pieces of my grandmother's collection. The governor's wife, who hadn't quite made it to the exit, turned back to witness the scene. Her expression shifted from embarrassment to fascination as she realized she was watching not just a scandal, but a moment that would be remembered in Los Angeles cultural history. Mrs. Reynolds, Amanda Chen from the LA Times approached the stage, digital recorder in hand. Would you care to comment on the evidence suggesting your mother-in-law sold over $30 million worth of historical instruments and manuscripts without legal authorization? Before I could respond, Evelyn found her voice again. Everything we did was legal. Sophia gave James power of attorney. We have documentation. She fumbled in her purse, face paling as she realized certain papers were missing. You mean these? I held up a folder Theodore had given me earlier. The original power of attorney documents? The ones that specifically excluded any authority over the Romano collection? I turned to the gathered press. My grandmother was very specific about how her legacy should be preserved. Everything was clearly documented, including the fact that no sale could occur without explicit approval from the Romano Foundation's Board of Trustees. James's face contorted with rage. You planned this, he spat. You knew Mother was announcing. The scholarship fund tonight. You set us up. I let his words hang in the air for a moment, then stepped forward to the microphone still positioned at center stage. Actually, you set yourselves up. I didn't force you to steal my inheritance. I didn't make you forge my signature or falsify provenance documents. I simply waited and watched, documenting everything, just like my grandmother taught me. The hall had grown eerily quiet. Hundreds of witnesses to this family implosion. Among them, I spotted familiar faces, students from my grandmother's last master class, now professional musicians themselves. They'd come tonight expecting to see her legacy honored. Instead, they were watching it being reclaimed. The Romano collection, I continued, my voice steady, was never meant to be sold off piece by piece to fund private ambitions. My grandmother created it to be a living library, accessible to students and scholars. Each piece tells a story of musical history, of artists and composers who shaped our understanding of classical music. I gestured to the Steinway. This piano isn't just an expensive instrument. It survived war, crossed oceans, and helped launch countless careers. My grandmother used it to teach students who couldn't afford lessons. She believed music belonged to everyone, not just the wealthy elite. A subtle movement caught my eye. Several board members were quietly distancing themselves from James and Evelyn, both physically and metaphorically. They'd seen the evidence Theodore had compiled: offshore accounts, falsified sales records, diverted funds. The Reynolds' carefully constructed facade was crumbling in real time. "Mrs. Reynolds," another reporter called out, "what happens to the conservatory now?" I smiled, thinking of the documents Theodore had prepared. The building itself was purchased with funds from the illegal sale of Romano collection pieces. Under the law, that makes it proceeds of theft. However, I paused, seeing hope drain from Evelyn's face. The Romano Foundation is prepared to negotiate its purchase at fair market value, to be operated as my grandmother originally intended, a true community music center, open to students of all backgrounds. The headlines would write themselves: "Stolen Legacy Reclaimed, Romano Foundation Rises from Reynolds Scandal." But the real story wasn't in the headlines. It was in the details my grandmother had taught me to appreciate, both in music and in life. A young violinist, barely 17, caught my eye from the audience. She clutched her instrument case, looking devastated. I recognized her as one of the scholarship recipients Evelyn had been planning to announce tonight. "Don't worry," I said, speaking directly to her but loud enough for everyone to hear. "The Romano Foundation will honor all scholarship commitments. My grandmother believed in nurturing talent, not exploiting it. That's a legacy worth preserving." As federal agents began escorting James and Evelyn toward the exit, I sat back down at the piano. Without announcement or flourish, I began to play. Not Tchaikovsky this time, but a simple Argentine folk melody my grandmother used to love. Its honest, unadorned notes filled the hall, a cleansing breath after the storm. The morning after the conservatory opening brought Los Angeles a storm, the first in months. I sat in my grandmother's study, surrounded by empty shelves that had once held centuries of musical history. Rain tapped against the windows in an irregular rhythm, nature's own dissonant symphony. Theodore spread dozens of documents across the antique desk, each paper revealing another layer of the Reynolds deception. "The scope is larger than we initially thought," he said, highlighting a series of transactions. "They didn't just sell the visible pieces. They'd been quietly auctioning off your grandmother's unpublished compositions." My hands trembled as I picked up a sales record. Original manuscripts, personal notations, even incomplete works, all sold to private collectors under the guise of estate management. These weren't just pieces of paper. They were my grandmother's thoughts, her creative process, her unfinished dreams. "How many?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. 27 complete manuscripts, 43 partial scores, and... Theodore hesitated, pulling out a particular document. They found buyers for all 12 of her symphony sketches, the ones she was working on before she passed. The shock hit me like a physical blow. Those symphonies were my grandmother's final project, her attempt to blend classical European structures with traditional Argentine rhythms. She'd spent her last years developing them, often calling me at midnight to play new passages over the phone. "The good news," Theodore continued, sensing my distress, "is that the sales were recent enough to track. The FBI's art crime team is already reaching out to buyers. Most are legitimate collectors who had no idea the pieces were sold illegally. They're cooperating fully." A knock at the study door interrupted us. Maria entered, carrying a tray of coffee and an iPad showing the morning's news coverage. "You should see this," she said softly, setting everything down. "It's about Mrs. Evelyn's private vault." The headline made my coffee grow cold. "Reynolds Scandal Deepens. Historic sheet music found hidden in private collection." The accompanying photos showed climate-controlled storage units filled with carefully preserved documents, pieces of my inheritance that Evelyn had kept for herself rather than sell. "She was building her own collection," Theodore explained, scanning the article. "Everything she thought was most valuable, she stored away. The rest she sold to fund the conservatory. Classic art theft methodology. Keep the best, liquidate the rest." My phone buzzed with a message from Amanda Chen. "Need your comment on new developments. Buyers coming forward with additional Romano pieces. Story running in 1 hour." Before I could respond, another message arrived. This one from James's private number. "We need to talk. There's more you don't know." I showed the message to Theodore, who immediately began typing on his laptop. Could be a trap, could be genuine. Either way. He turned the screen toward me, showing a surveillance feed of the county jail's visitor center. Let's find out what else they've been hiding. The drive to the detention center felt surreal. Yesterday, I'd been performing Tchaikovsky on my grandmother's piano. Today, I was going to face my husband across a visitor's room table, wondering what other betrayals he had to confess. Security was thorough but efficient. They led me to a private consultation room, a courtesy arranged by the district attorney's office, who hoped any additional information could help recover more stolen pieces. James looked smaller somehow, his expensive suit replaced by standard-issue clothes. The arrogance that had defined him was gone, replaced by something that might have been regret, or maybe just resignation. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice hoarse. "There's something you need to know about your grandmother's last symphony." I leaned forward despite myself. "What about it?" "Mother didn't sell all the sketches," he said, watching my reaction carefully. "The final movement, the one Victoria said would be her masterpiece, she kept it, said it was her insurance policy." "Insurance against what?" James laughed bitterly. "Against you. She always knew you were smarter than you let on. Kept saying, we needed leverage, something to keep you in line if you ever figured out what we were doing." The implications hit me like a wave. "Where is it?" "In a safe deposit box." "Downtown Union Bank. The key—" He hesitated. "The key is hidden in the piano bench. Mother had a false bottom installed when we moved it to the conservatory." I stood up, already reaching for my phone to text Theodore, but James's next words stopped me cold. "She made changes to it," he said quietly. "Added her own notations, claimed co-authorship. If you try to claim it legally, she'll fight you with everything she has left. She'll destroy the original rather than let you have it." The cruel calculation of it stole my breath. Evelyn hadn't just stolen my inheritance, she'd taken my grandmother's final work and poisoned it, turning it into a weapon. "Why are you telling me this now?" James met my eyes for the first time. "Because I finally read the symphony's title page. Your grandmother called it Legado de Amor, Legacy of Love. She dedicated it to you, Sophia. Said it was her gift to the granddaughter who understood that music isn't about possession, it's about sharing beauty with the world." I left the detention center in a daze, Theodore's words from our earlier conversation echoing in my mind. The best revenge isn't taking something back, it's making sure the truth can never be hidden again. The Union Bank's marble lobby echoed with each step as Theodore and I followed the manager to the safe deposit vault. The key from the piano bench felt impossibly heavy in my hand, a small brass thing that held the weight of my grandmother's final creation. "Box 2317, the manager announced, checking his records. "Last accessed 3 months ago by Mrs. Evelyn Reynolds." He paused, glancing at the court order in his hand. "Our records show unusual activity patterns, multiple access requests at odd hours." The vault door swung open with a pneumatic hiss. Inside, the manager located the box and placed it on a private viewing table. "Take all the time you need," he said, leaving us alone with the evidence team's photographer. My hands shook as I inserted the key. The lock turned with a clean click, too smooth for something that held such complicated history. Inside, wrapped in acid-free paper and sealed in archival plastic, lay my grandmother's final symphony. "Wait!" Theodore said as I reached for it. The photographer stepped forward, documenting everything exactly as we found it. Evidence collection had become our new normal. The manuscript was larger than I expected, nearly 200 pages of handwritten score, covered in my grandmother's distinctive notation style. But James had been right. Mixed with her elegant script were other marks, harsh blue ink annotations in Evelyn's hand, attempting to alter the original composition. "Look at this," Theodore pointed to a note in the margin. Written in my grandmother's hand was a message I'd never seen. "For my Sophia, who understands that music, like love, grows stronger when shared. Let these notes fly free." The photographer captured every page as I carefully turned them. The symphony was unlike anything in my grandmother's published work. She had woven Argentine folk melodies through classical structures, creating something entirely new. But Evelyn's additions tried to force it into conventional patterns, stripping away its uniqueness. "There's something else," the photographer said, pointing to a slight bulge in the box's lining. Carefully, we peeled back the fabric to reveal a hidden compartment. Inside was a small recorder and a USB drive. My grandmother's voice filled the room as I pressed play. "Mi amor, if you're hearing this, then something has happened to her collection." I knew the Reynolds couldn't be trusted. I saw how they looked at our legacy, like vultures circling precious cargo. But I also knew my Sophia would understand the true worth of what we built. Tears blurred my vision as her voice continued. "The symphony they think they've stolen? It's not complete. The real final movement is hidden where only a true musician would think to look. Remember what I taught you about Beethoven's secret?" My hand flew to my mouth. When I was 12, my grandmother had told me about Beethoven's habit of hiding important notes in seemingly simple passages. "The truth hides in plain sight," she'd said. "Wrapped in music everyone thinks they know." "The USB drive," Theodore said, already connecting it to his laptop. "It's encrypted." I studied the drive's surface, noting the subtle scratches that formed a pattern. "Those aren't scratches," I whispered. "They're musical notes. The opening bars of the Argentine lullaby she used to sing me to sleep." The encryption yielded to the melody, revealing hundreds of files. Not just the true final movement, but something far more valuable: detailed recordings of my grandmother composing it, explaining each creative decision, preserving her artistic process in its purest form. "This is extraordinary," Theodore breathed, scanning the files. "She didn't just save the music, she documented everything. Her influences, her techniques, her entire creative journey." Another audio file began playing. "The Reynolds think music is something to own, to lock away in vaults and sell to the highest bidder. But you and I know better, mi amor. Music is meant to live, to breathe, to evolve. That's why I've left you. Not just the notes, but the story behind them. Share it. Teach it. Let it grow." I sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what we'd discovered. This wasn't just a symphony. It was a masterclass, a legacy, a message of love wrapped in staffs and clefs. "There's one more thing," Theodore said, opening a final folder. Instructions for a music education program, completely planned out. She designed it to be implemented through community centers, reaching students who couldn't afford traditional conservatory training. The truth hit me with stunning clarity. My grandmother hadn't just left me her music. She'd left me a mission. The Reynolds had seen her collection as assets to be liquidated. They never understood that its true value lay not in its price, but in its potential to transform lives. "What do you want to do?" Theodore asked quietly. I touched the score, feeling the texture of the paper beneath my fingers. "Exactly what she wanted. We're going to share it with the world. But first," I smiled, thinking of the press conference, scheduled for tomorrow. "First, we're going to let Evelyn know that her insurance policy just backfired spectacularly." My grandmother's voice played one final time. "Remember, mi amor, the most beautiful music comes from hearts that are free. To soar, now fly." The detention center's interview room felt colder than before. Evelyn sat across from me, her designer jumpsuit a jarring contrast to the institutional surroundings. Her silver hair had lost its perfect styling, but her eyes retained their calculating gleam. Come to negotiate? She asked, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her sleeve. I assume James told you about the symphony? Her lips curved in what might have been a smile. My modifications make it quite impossible to determine original authorship. I placed a tablet on the table between us, queuing up the first recording. My grandmother's voice filled the room. Composition notes, Symphony number 12, Legado de Amor, first movement development. The color drained from Evelyn's face as the recording continued, documenting every creative decision, every musical choice. In my grandmother's own voice, "That's not possible," she whispered. "We searched everything." "Clearly not everything," I replied, switching to video footage of my grandmother actually composing the piece. She documented the entire creative process, every note, every change, every inspiration, all time-stamped and authenticated. Theodore entered with a thick folder. "The forensic musicologist's report," he announced, laying out photographs. "Spectral analysis of the ink shows your additions were made within the last 3 months. The paper aging was artificially induced. Quite clever, but ultimately detectable." Evelyn's composure cracked. "You have no idea what it's like," she spat. "Watching someone like your grandmother command such respect in the music world, I studied for years, practiced until my hands bled. But because I wasn't born into the right family, didn't have the right connections." "Is that what you think this was about?" I asked, genuinely surprised. "Connections? My grandmother grew up poor in Buenos Aires. She practiced on a broken piano in her father's grocery store. Everything she achieved, she earned. And then she just gave it away." Evelyn's voice dripped with contempt. "Taking in charity cases, teaching street kids for free. That collection could have funded a world-class conservatory. Instead, she wasted it on people who'd never appreciate its value." I opened another file on the tablet, security footage from the bank vault. "Speaking of the collection, would you like to explain these visits? 3 a.m. access to the safe deposit box, carrying sheet music that matches the descriptions of pieces you claimed were sold overseas?" For the first time, real fear flickered in Evelyn's eyes. The footage clearly showed her making multiple late-night visits, each time with different pieces from my grandmother's collection. "You didn't sell everything," I continued. "You kept the most valuable pieces for yourself, planning to wait until the scandal died down. The buyers you claimed purchased them? They don't exist. The offshore accounts trace back to shell companies you control." "You can't prove that," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Theodore laid out more documents. "Actually, we can. Your private vault at home?" The FBI found quite an interesting collection. Original manuscripts, rare recordings, even personal correspondence from composers. All properly cataloged in your own handwriting, complete with notes about their potential market value. "I was preserving them," Evelyn insisted. "Those pieces needed proper care, professional handling. Like this?" I played another video, security footage of her roughly shoving priceless manuscripts into storage bins, bending corners, ignoring proper archival procedures. "The conservation expert's report estimates the damage you caused will take years to repair." A knock at the door announced the arrival of the district attorney. "Mrs. Reynolds, we're ready to discuss the terms of cooperation. Your son has already provided a full statement." Evelyn's facade finally shattered. "James would never," she began, then saw the truth in our faces. "What did you offer him?" "Nothing," I replied. "He made his choice when he read my grandmother's dedication. Some people can still recognize the difference between possession and legacy." The DA cleared his throat. "Mrs. Reynolds, we have a limited window for this offer. Full disclosure of all stolen items' locations, complete cooperation in their recovery, and a guilty plea to reduced charges." "And if I refuse?" I stood, gathering my materials. "Then we proceed with the full prosecution. The FBI's art crime team is quite interested in the international aspects of your theft. I hear art crime charges carry surprisingly long sentences. You'd send your mother-in-law to prison? Evelyn's voice wavered between threat and plea. You sent my grandmother's legacy to the highest bidder, I countered. The difference is, I'm giving you a choice. As I turned to leave, Evelyn called, Out, the symphony. What will you do with it? I paused at the door. Exactly what she intended. It premieres next month at a free concert in her old neighborhood in Buenos Aires. Local music students will perform alongside professionals. The entire event will be streamed worldwide, with open-source teaching materials available to anyone who wants to study it. You're just giving it away, she said, disgust evident in her tone. No, I corrected her. I'm letting it live. There's a difference. I nodded to the DA. She's all yours. Buenos Aires hummed with anticipation. The historic Teatro Colón, where my grandmother had given her first professional performance 60 years ago, was packed to capacity. Outside, giant screens had been set up in the plaza, broadcasting the event to thousands more. I stood in my grandmother's old dressing room, now transformed into a temporary command center. Theodore coordinated with Interpol agents across 3 continents as recovered pieces of the Romano collection arrived in real time. Paris just confirmed delivery of the Paganini manuscripts, he reported, checking his tablet. Tokyo found the missing Stradivarius in a private collector's vault. The collector is cooperating fully. Apparently, he's furious about being deceived by Evelyn. A knock at the door revealed Amanda Chen, who had turned the Reynolds scandal into a global story about art theft and cultural preservation. The international broadcast feed is ready, she said. We're linking with music schools in 47 countries. Estimated virtual audience, 2 million and growing. I nodded, thinking of how my grandmother would have loved this moment. The story had resonated far beyond the music world, touching on universal themes of family, betrayal, and the true meaning of legacy. The students are ready, Maria announced, poking her head in. She had taken charge of coordinating the young musicians who would be part of tonight's performance, talented kids from local community programs, many of whom had never set foot in a venue like this before. In the green room, 30 young musicians in formal attire sat with their instruments, vibrating with nervous energy. Among them was Carlos, a 15-year-old violinist from my grandmother's old neighborhood. He clutched a Guarneri violin, one of the recovered pieces, now permanently allocated to the student program. Remember what we practiced, I told them, in Spanish, seeing my grandmother's spirit in their eager faces. Tonight we're not just playing music, we're showing the world that art belongs to everyone. The stage manager appeared. 5 minutes to broadcast. The FBI wants to make their announcement before the performance. Right on cue, Special Agent Lisa Wong took the stage. The head of the art crime team had become an unexpected ally in our fight to recover the scattered pieces of the Romano collection. Thanks to international cooperation and the dedication of countless individuals, she announced, we have successfully recovered over 90% of the stolen items. More importantly, we've established a new framework for protecting musical heritage. The screens behind her displayed images of the recovery effort. Rare instruments being carefully packed in climate-controlled cases, manuscripts restored by conservation experts, recordings being digitally preserved. Each image represented a piece of history saved from disappearing into private vaults. But tonight isn't about what was almost lost, Agent Wong continued. It's about what has been gained. The Romano Foundation's new open access initiative will ensure these treasures are available to students and scholars worldwide. I watched the students' faces as she explained how the recovered collection would support music education globally. The Guarneri in Carlos's hands would be joined by other fine instruments, all reserved for talented young musicians who couldn't afford their own. My phone buzzed, a message from James's lawyer. His cooperation had led to more recoveries, earning him a reduced sentence. The message was simple. He's watching the broadcast. Says to tell you your grandmother would be proud. The stage lights dimmed, signaling my cue. I stepped into the spotlight, facing the audience both present and virtual. The piano, my grandmother's Steinway, now restored to its rightful place, waited center stage. 60 years ago, I began, a young pianist from a poor neighborhood stood on this stage and played her heart out. Tonight, we honor her legacy, not just through music, but through action. Every recovered piece from the Romano collection will be used to teach, to inspire, to create new generations of artists. I gestured to the students who took their places around me. Tonight's performance of Legado de Amor isn't just a symphony. It's a promise to every young musician who dreams of making their voice heard. The score and all teaching materials will be freely available online, along with my grandmother's own notes and recordings. The first notes rose from the piano, joined one by young voices and seasoned professionals alike. As the music filled the historic hall, I thought of Evelyn, sitting in her cell as the performance streamed on prison television. She had tried to possess this legacy, to lock it away, in private vaults. Instead, she had inadvertently helped set it free. In the soaring melodies and complex harmonies, I heard my grandmother's voice. Music is like water, mi amor. Try to hold it too tightly and it slips through your fingers. But let it flow freely, and it will nourish everything it touches. The morning headlines told a story that even my grandmother couldn't have scripted. Romano Symphony performance crashes music education websites, unprecedented global demand for access. 2 million viewers had become 10 million overnight, with conservatories worldwide scrambling to handle download requests for the teaching materials. I sat in my hotel room overlooking Plaza Laval, reading emails from across the globe. A youth orchestra in Kenya wanted to perform the second movement. A music school in Vietnam requested permission to translate the teaching materials. A technology company offered to create a free app that would make the entire Romano collection accessible to students everywhere. The servers are struggling to keep up, Theodore reported, juggling 3 phones and a laptop. But there's something else you need to see. He turned on the television, where CNN was broadcasting live from outside the Manhattan District Attorney's office. In a stunning development, the reporter announced, dozens of private collectors have come forward voluntarily to return pieces from other stolen musical collections. The Romano case has triggered what experts are calling a conscience avalanche in the world of private art acquisition. My phone rang. Agent Wong from the FBI's art crime team. "You've started something bigger than we imagined," she said without preamble. 3 major auction houses just announced new authentication protocols for musical artifacts. They're calling it the Romano Standard. A text message popped up from an unknown number. It was a photo of James watching the symphony broadcast in the prison library, surrounded by other inmates. The accompanying message read, "He's been teaching us about classical music. Says everyone deserves to understand its beauty." Maria burst in, waving a tablet. "You have to see this. The street. Musicians in San Telmo. They're performing parts of your grandmother's symphony." She pulled up a viral video showing informal performances breaking out across Buenos Aires' famous street art district. I walked to the window, looking down at the plaza where my grandmother once played for coins as a child. Now, a young girl sat at a weathered upright piano, carefully picking out the melody from Legado de Amor, while passers-by dropped pesos in her tip jar. "There's more," Theodore said. "The conservatory board, the real one, not Evelyn's appointees, has voted unanimously. They're renaming it the Victoria Romano Center for Musical Access. All programs will be free to qualifying students. News kept flowing in. A prestigious music publisher was releasing a special edition of my grandmother's complete works, with proceeds funding scholarships. Universities were creating research positions focused on preserving musical heritage. Cultural organizations worldwide were reviewing their acquisition policies. "Your grandmother's story has resonated far beyond the music world," Amanda Chen observed, joining us with her ever-present recorder. It sparked a global conversation about cultural heritage, about who gets to own art, about the responsibility of privilege. I picked up a copy of the symphony score, not the corrupted version Evelyn had tried to claim, but the true final manuscript, now marked with annotations from student orchestras around the world. Young musicians were already adding their own interpretations, keeping the music alive and evolving. A large envelope arrived from Theodore's legal team. Inside were the final dissolution papers for my marriage to James, along with confirmation that all Romano collection pieces had been legally returned to the foundation's ownership. But there was something else. A letter from Evelyn. "I was wrong," she had written. "I thought owning beauty made you beautiful. I thought controlling art gave you power over its spirit. Watching those children perform Victoria's symphony, seeing their faces as they discovered its magic. I finally understand what she meant about music being free." The plaza was filling up with people, drawn by the young pianist's impromptu performance. More street musicians joined in, a violinist here, a cellist there, gradually building the symphony's complex harmonies. None of them had rehearsed together, but the music connected them anyway. My phone lit up with a notification. Someone had started a hashtag, Romano Legacy. It was trending worldwide, filled with videos of musicians young and old, professional and amateur, all playing pieces from the recovered collection. A global orchestra connected by nothing but love for the music. "Your grandmother once told me," Maria said softly, "that the true test of a musician isn't how well they play, but how many others they inspire to make music." I thought of the Steinway, now permanently installed in the Teatro's public rehearsal, space where anyone could play it. Of the Guarneri violins and Stradivarius cellos, no longer locked in private collections but singing in the hands of gifted students. Of centuries-old manuscripts being digitized and shared with music lovers everywhere. The young pianist in the plaza finished her piece to enthusiastic applause. As she stood to bow, I recognized her clothes, the same school uniform my grandmother had worn 70 years ago, when she first dared to dream that a grocer's daughter could become a classical pianist. Some legacies, I realized, aren't meant to be kept. They're meant to be set free, to grow and change and inspire. My grandmother had known this all along. The Reynolds' greatest mistake wasn't stealing her collection. It was thinking they could own something that was meant to belong to everyone. 6 months after the Buenos Aires concert, I found myself testifying before a UNESCO committee in Paris. The Romano case had sparked an international movement to protect musical heritage, and policymakers wanted to understand how private greed had nearly erased a century of cultural history. The true cost wasn't just financial, I explained to the assembled delegates. Every piece Evelyn and James sold represented opportunities stolen from future generations. Each manuscript locked in a private vault was knowledge denied to students who could have learned from it. The committee chamber hummed with translation services as my words reached representatives from over 50 nations. On the screens behind me, photos cycled through the recovered pieces. Not just my grandmother's collection, but dozens of others that had emerged in the wake of our case. What we discovered, I continued, was a systematic network of private collectors working to monopolize musical heritage. They didn't just want to own the instruments and manuscripts. They wanted to control who had access to cultural knowledge itself. Agent Wong presented evidence showing how the Reynolds scheme had unveiled a larger pattern. Wealthy collectors had been quietly accumulating historically significant musical pieces, driving prices beyond what museums and educational institutions could afford. But here's what they didn't count on, I said, pulling up images from the global Romano legacy movement. You can't privatize inspiration. When we made these materials freely available online, it sparked a creative explosion that no vault could contain. The evidence was undeniable. Music schools in underserved communities were reporting record enrollment. Street musicians were performing complex classical pieces that had been locked away for generations. Online communities were forming around newly accessible historical compositions. A delegate from Kenya shared how her country had used our case to draft new cultural heritage protection laws. A Japanese representative described how their major corporations were now donating private collections to public institutions. Brazil announced a program to distribute recovered instruments to youth orchestras in favelas. During a break, I checked messages from Theodore. The Romano Foundation's digital archive had just logged its millionth registered user. Universities worldwide were using our authentication protocols as a model for protecting other forms of cultural heritage. Ms. Martinez, a young UNESCO intern, approached with a tablet. "You should see this." She pulled up a live feed from the Metropolitan Opera House in New York. James, as part of his rehabilitation program, was teaching music appreciation to fellow inmates. The program had been so successful that other prisons were implementing similar initiatives. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who had helped try to privatize musical heritage was now helping prove my grandmother's point, that music belongs to everyone, regardless of their circumstances. Back in the committee chamber, discussions turned to practical matters. How could we prevent future attempts to monopolize cultural artifacts? What systems needed to be in place to ensure educational access? How could we balance private ownership with public benefit? The solution, I proposed, isn't to eliminate private collection entirely. It's to change how we think about cultural ownership. When my grandmother built her collection, she didn't see herself as an owner. She saw herself as a custodian, responsible for preserving these treasures for future generations. The UNESCO secretary made an unprecedented announcement. They were establishing the Romano Protocol, a new international framework for protecting and sharing cultural heritage. Private collectors could maintain their collections, but with mandatory educational access requirements. My phone buzzed with a message from an unexpected source, Evelyn's former assistant. She had documentation of other private collections, at risk, including a cache of indigenous musical instruments that a consortium was trying to acquire and export. "This is bigger than one family's betrayal," I told the committee. "It's about recognizing that cultural heritage isn't a commodity to be hoarded. Every piece we recover, every manuscript we make accessible, every instrument we put in a student's hands helps ensure that our shared musical legacy survives." A delegation from Argentina presented their findings on the economic impact of our open access initiative. Tourism in my grandmother's old neighborhood had surged. Street musicians were earning more. Music schools were creating jobs. What the Reynolds had seen as assets to be liquidated were actually seeds that, when planted in the community, grew into sustainable cultural ecosystems. The Reynolds thought they were preserving history by locking it away, I concluded. But history isn't meant to be preserved like a butterfly pinned under glass. It's meant to be alive, to evolve, to inspire new creations. As the session ended, delegates approached with their own stories of cultural heritage at risk. A Vietnamese orchestra's ancient instruments sold to foreign collectors. African musical manuscripts disappearing into private European collections. Indigenous Australian songlines being commercialized without community consent. "Your grandmother's case gave us a roadmap," Agent Wong said as we left the UNESCO building. "Now we can help others reclaim their musical heritage too." Looking out over the Paris evening, I thought about how my grandmother's piano had traveled from war-torn Vienna to become a symbol of musical democracy. Sometimes I realized the greatest revenge isn't in winning, it's in transforming loss into legacy. 2 weeks after the UNESCO hearing, I received a package from the federal prison, where James was serving his reduced sentence. Inside was a worn leather journal, my grandmother's personal diary from her early years in Buenos Aires. The accompanying note was brief. "Found this in Mother's safety deposit box. It belongs with you." The diary's pages held more than memories. Between accounts of practice sessions and street performances were detailed observations about teaching music to neighborhood children. My grandmother had been developing her educational philosophy even then, believing that talent could flourish anywhere if given the chance. "You've done more than recover stolen property," Agent Wong said during our final case review. "You've exposed how cultural gatekeeping perpetuates inequality." She spread photographs across her desk, images of rare instruments now being played in community centers, historical manuscripts being studied in public universities. The Reynolds case had become required reading in art law programs. Law enforcement agencies worldwide were using our investigation as a model for tracking stolen cultural artifacts. But the most significant changes were happening at the ground level. I visited a middle school in East Los Angeles where students were practicing the second movement of my grandmother's symphony. Their instructor, a former student of the Reynolds Conservatory, had resigned in protest when the theft was exposed. Now she was building a youth orchestra program using instruments from the recovered collection. "Watch this," she said, pulling up a video chat. The screen filled with faces of young musicians from around the world, a virtual orchestra connecting kids from Buenos Aires favelas, Nairobi slums, Bangkok suburbs, and dozens of other locations. They were all learning the same piece, sharing tips and techniques across continents. Theodore's latest report showed the broader impact. Museums were reviewing their acquisition policies. Private collectors were voluntarily opening their collections for educational access. The art world was shifting from ownership to stewardship. "Your grandmother's diary entries predicted this," he noted, referencing her early writings. She saw music as a living force that thrives on sharing, not hoarding. The Reynolds never understood that they were fighting against the very nature of art itself. The Romano Foundation had transformed from a private trust into a global educational network. Every recovered piece was digitally archived and made available to music students worldwide. The physical collection traveled between partner institutions, ensuring maximum accessibility. A notification popped up on my phone. Evelyn was being transferred to a minimum security facility. Her cooperation in recovering other stolen collections had earned her privileges, including the ability to teach music theory to fellow inmates. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. She asked about the student performances, her lawyer mentioned during a final consultation. Said she never imagined your grandmother's music could reach so many people. The admission carried weight. Evelyn had finally understood what she'd tried to destroy. The young pianist I'd seen in Plaza Laval was now studying at Juilliard on a Romano Foundation scholarship. She wasn't alone. Hundreds of talented students who would have been priced out of elite music education were getting opportunities they deserved. My grandmother's Steinway had found its permanent home in a public conservatory built in her old neighborhood. The piano that survived war and exile now served its intended purpose, teaching new generations that music transcends ownership. Walking through the conservatory's practice rooms, I heard fragments of familiar melodies mixed with new interpretations. Students were building on my grandmother's work, creating fusion pieces that blended classical structures with their own cultural traditions. "This is what terrified them," Agent Wong observed during a visit. "Not just losing control of valuable assets, but losing control of the narrative. They wanted to own the music's past, but you've given it a future instead." The final statistics were telling. Over 2,000 stolen pieces recovered, 15,000 students directly benefiting from access to historical instruments, millions of digital downloads of previously locked-away musical manuscripts. The numbers represented something bigger than revenge. They represented resurrection. James sent word from prison that he was documenting everything he'd learned about art theft networks. His insider knowledge, combined with our recovery methods, was helping authorities prevent similar crimes worldwide. "Your grandmother used to say that music is like a river," Maria reminded me, watching students arrive for morning practice. "It can be channeled, but never truly owned." The Reynolds tried to build dams, but you helped it flow free again. Chew. Diary's final pages contained a surprise, preliminary sketches for an educational manifesto my grandmother never finished. Her vision of democratic music education, once nearly lost to private greed, was now being realized on a scale she could hardly have imagined. As I closed the journal, a student began playing the opening notes of Legado de Amor in a nearby practice room. The melody carried through the halls, joined gradually by other instruments as more students arrived. They weren't just playing the notes, they were proving that the greatest legacy isn't what we keep, but what we set free. 1 year to the day after the conservatory showdown, I stood in my grandmother's restored study, surrounded by the recovered pieces of her legacy. The last item had arrived that morning, a rare Amati violin that Evelyn had sold to a collector in Singapore. Its return marked the final piece of our global recovery effort. The collection is complete again, Theodore announced, updating the Foundation's database. But it's not the same collection anymore, is it? He gestured to the live feed displaying on multiple screens. Students across 5 continents practicing with historical instruments, scholars accessing digitized manuscripts, community orchestras performing once private pieces. A notification chimed on my laptop. The Romano Foundation's digital archive had just logged its 10 millionth download. The most popular file wasn't a famous composition or rare recording. It was my grandmother's teaching notes, her methodologies for making classical music accessible to anyone willing to learn. "There's something you should see," Agent Wong said, entering with a thick file. "We've finished analyzing Evelyn's private records. The scope of what she planned." She spread photographs across the desk, blueprints for a network of elite conservatories, each designed to control access to specific pieces of musical history. She wanted to create a musical aristocracy, I realized, examining the documents. Complete control over who could learn, perform, or even hear certain pieces. The plans included pricing structures that would have put serious musical education out of reach for all but the wealthiest students. My phone buzzed with a message from James's prison counselor. He had started a music theory program for fellow inmates, using the Foundation's online resources. The class had become so popular that other correctional facilities were implementing similar programs. "Your grandmother predicted this too," Theodore said, pulling up a newly discovered letter from her early teaching days. She wrote that music's true power isn't in its scarcity, but in its ability to multiply. The more you share it, the more it grows. The study's window offered a view of the conservatory's new community performance space. A group of young musicians was setting up for evening practice, students from the neighborhood program my grandmother had started decades ago. The same program Evelyn had tried to dismantle. The final audit came in, Agent Wong reported, checking her notes. Total value of recovered items, approximately $157 million. But the cultural impact. She pulled up statistics showing increased music program enrollment in underserved communities, rising attendance at classical performances, growing interest in musical preservation. A young violinist caught my attention through the window. She was playing the Amati that had just been returned, her technique already showing promise. Last year, she had been selling flowers on the street. Now she was on track for a full scholarship. "Your mother-in-law sent this," Theodore said quietly, handing me an envelope. Inside was a letter Evelyn had written from prison. Her words, once so full of entitlement and disdain, showed the first genuine signs of understanding. "I watched the student concert online," she wrote. "Saw children playing instruments I once thought too precious for their hands. Their music, it was pure, untainted by the greed that consumed me. I finally understand what Victoria meant about legacy being alive." The Romano Protocol, as UNESCO had named our preservation framework, was being implemented worldwide. Private collectors were opening their vaults, sharing treasures long hidden from public view. Museums were rethinking accessibility, turning storage rooms into teaching spaces. "Look at this," Agent Wong said, pulling up a global map. Colored dots showed real-time activity in the Foundation's network, performances, lessons, downloads, collaborations. The screen pulsed with life, each point representing someone connecting with music that might have been lost forever. The final piece of my grandmother's symphony was being performed that evening, not by professional musicians in an elite venue, but by a mixed ensemble of students, street performers, and community players. The event would be streamed globally, with participating groups joining virtually from every continent. As twilight settled over the city, I opened my grandmother's diary to its last entry, written just days before her death. "Music is not a treasure to be buried," she had written, "but a seed to be planted. Those who try to own it will find it slips through their fingers. Those who share it will watch it grow into forests of sound." The young violinist outside began playing the opening notes of Legado de Amor. Others joined in. A street musician with a weathered cello, a student practicing flute, a retired teacher on piano. The music rose unplanned but perfect, each player adding their voice to the growing symphony. My phone lit up with messages from around the world. Similar spontaneous performances were breaking out everywhere the piece had been shared. From favelas to conservatories, from prison music programs to elementary schools, people were playing not just the notes, but the spirit of what my grandmother had tried to teach. The Romano collection had come home, but its true victory wasn't in the recovery of priceless objects. It was in proving that music, like love, grows strongest when shared freely. The Reynolds had tried to own a legacy, but instead, they had helped set it free. 5 years after the discovery of my stolen inheritance, I sat in a small cafe in my grandmother's old Buenos Aires neighborhood. The morning paper featured a story about Evelyn's release from prison. She had served her reduced sentence and, in an unexpected twist, chosen to stay in Argentina to work with a prison music education program. "The students don't know who I am," she had told the interviewer. "They just know I understand both sides of the story, how greed can poison beauty and how sharing can multiply it." The article mentioned her work helping authorities recover other stolen cultural artifacts, a form of restitution that went beyond her legal obligations. The cafe's radio played a familiar melody, a street musician's jazz interpretation of my grandmother's symphony. The piece had taken on a life of its own, adapted and reimagined by musicians worldwide. Each new version added something unique while preserving the core spirit of the original. My phone buzzed with a video call from Theodore. "You need to see this," he said, panning his camera across a gathering in New York. The Metropolitan Museum of Art was hosting a landmark symposium. The Romano Effect, 5 years of cultural democracy. James was there, having earned early release for his role in recovering stolen artifacts. He now headed a nonprofit dedicated to preventing art theft. "The numbers are extraordinary," Theodore continued. "Over 50,000 recovered pieces worldwide. 300 new community music programs. Millions of students accessing previously restricted materials." He switched to a presentation slide showing the global impact of the Romano Protocol. Group of young musicians caught my attention through the cafe window. They were setting up in the plaza, unpacking instruments that bore the Romano Foundation's mark. These weren't the priceless antiques Evelyn had coveted, but quality reproductions created through a partnership with ethical instrument makers. "Your grandmother's diary has been published in 12 languages," Theodore added. "The teaching methods she developed in this very neighborhood are being used in music programs from Siberia to the Sahara." The book had become a manual for democratic music education, its principles applied far beyond classical performance. Maria joined me at the cafe, bringing news from the foundation. "The last of Evelyn's private vaults has been opened," she reported. "But it's what we found inside." She handed me a sealed envelope yellowed with age. The handwriting on the front was my grandmother's. The letter was dated 2 weeks before her death, addressed to Evelyn. I see how you look at my collection, with hunger that has nothing to do with music. Remember this. What you possess possesses you. Choose wisely. My grandmother had known all along what might happen, yet she'd left everything exactly as it was, a test that would ultimately transform her legacy. My phone chimed with another notification. The Romano Foundation's digital archive had just welcomed its 100 millionth user. The most downloaded item wasn't a famous composition or rare recording. It was a simple teaching guide my grandmother had written for community music instructors. There's more, Maria said, pulling up a news alert. UNESCO had just ratified the expanded Romano Protocol, making it the global standard for cultural heritage protection. Private collectors worldwide were voluntarily opening their vaults, choosing stewardship over ownership. The young musicians in the plaza began to play, a fusion piece blending my grandmother's symphony with local folk rhythms. Through the cafe window, I watched passers-by stop to listen, some singing along, others adding impromptu harmonies. This was the true victory, music flowing freely, evolving, belonging to everyone. A final document awaited my signature, the official transfer of the Reynolds Conservatory building to a community trust. The space would become a public music center, offering free education to anyone willing to learn. Evelyn's monument to exclusivity would become a testament to accessibility. Your grandmother left one more surprise, Theodore said, sending a file to my phone. It was a recording from her last days, recently discovered in the final vault. Her voice, though weak, carried the same passion that had driven her entire life. Mi amor, if you're hearing this, you've faced a choice between possession and purpose. Remember, true legacy isn't what we keep, but what we set free. Music is life itself. It grows by being shared, dies by being hoarded. Let it fly, let it change, let it live. As if in response, the plaza musicians launched into the symphony's final movement. Their interpretation was different from the original, rougher, more spontaneous, filled with local color. Yet somehow it captured perfectly what my grandmother had tried to teach us all. The Reynolds had tried to steal an inheritance, but they had inadvertently helped create something far more valuable. A movement that transformed how the world viewed cultural heritage. Private collections became public treasures. Exclusive conservatories opened their doors. Music, in all its forms, flowed freely again. I opened my laptop to join the symposium's virtual session, where musicians, scholars, and students from around the world were discussing the future of cultural preservation. Among them was Carlos, the young violinist from the first community performance, now a respected teacher himself. The cafe owner turned up the radio as the plaza musicians reached the symphony's climax. All across the city, across the world, similar scenes were playing out. Music that might have been locked away forever was alive in countless variations, each performance adding to a legacy that grew stronger through sharing. My grandmother's final message echoed in my mind. The sweetest victory isn't in defeating those who wronged you, but in transforming their wrongs into something beautiful. The Reynolds had tried to steal a collection, but they had helped launch a revolution instead. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.